Earlier this week, the world commemorated the International Girl Child Day. To observe the moment, LoveLife held a discussion to reflect on the daily struggles faced by adolescent girls and young women fighting poverty, inequality, and finding themselves in households where their parents and caregivers are struggling to find or to keep jobs and make provision for them. LoveLife CEO Dr. Ncube-Nkomo is here to tell us more. Good evening and welcome to you, Linda. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you.
I mean, it's hard to do these interviews, right? But perhaps we'll take a shot at something positive in the opening. It's 10 years since the inaugural event. Are there any wins or any gains to report in the arena of protecting and advancing the rights of girls and young women?
The wins that are there are really more of ticking the box wins. So we now are raising girls in an environment that supposedly should be an enabling environment. If we look in the South African context, there's no girl that will ever be harmed because she's going to school and is living in a society where girls are not encouraged to go to school. We are in an environment where we're really trying to do the best to get the girl child to catch up. But while all those protocols have been signed, the question becomes implementation.
And we're going to come back to that piece because it is an important one in terms of how we make sustainable changes that materially alter the experience of girls and women. But this demographic that we're talking about, and as women we can probably relate, the plight of girls and young women has been worsened by poverty, health, unemployment and violence. All of these are pandemics in their own right that have been plaguing South Africa for many years now. How would you condense the biggest hurdles that this cohort or this demographic is facing every day?
I think you've spoken to them. So this is a demographic that's living in a world where we're saying sustainable development goals, gender equality. Then when you try to unpack what that looks like for girls and young women in South Africa, then that's where you start to see that, no, actually we're not making any progress. Because if you go into a home, the bulk of the household chores falls on the girl child. Therefore, her concentration levels or the time that she's got to devote to schoolwork or just recreation is minimized. You talk about the sexual abuse of girl children. I mean, you and I know, we now read about 10-year-olds giving birth. That would have been unheard of 20 years ago. It was more like 14, 15-year-olds, we're starting to experiment sexually. But a 10-year-old, that's the kind of environment that girls and young women ultimately are being raised in, where the whole community knows what's happening, but nobody says anything. And if I can just share a tweet I read this morning, somebody tweeted that there is a man in her community that's raping his child, stepdaughter. The mother is aware of it, but the police can't do anything because the mother is not prepared to open a case. And then the whole thread comes out from different people around how they know what's going on, but one will say, I go to the police station to open the case, and the station commander tells people in my community, I'm the one who opened the case. So there's still those issues of the unsafeness of girls at home, in community, and ultimately in greater society.
So that culture of secrecy is also endemic in communities, and for various reasons. There's a vulnerability or a fear of exposure. And as we've read in the research and these statistics, sometimes because there is a dependency, could be financial dependencies, family support dependencies that prevent people from speaking up. But if we were speaking to those people who were sharing on their thread today, if we were talking directly to people who'd rather just look away than lean in, look in and do something, how would you make that rallying call to them, Linda, to say, we can't do this anymore?
I would say, keeping quiet because the mother has kept quiet is not enough. We need to be thinking around, how will we support this child? Because it's all very well to say it's bread and butter issues, but what about the lifelong trauma that this child and every other little girl like her who is being failed by the entire system, all of us who are complicit, how does she go through life?
The next question that I designed for you was, why is our society still unable to remove barriers to girls and women being seen as equal to their male counterparts, or indeed those in minority communities being seen as equal to heterosexual males who, occupy that pedestal of being one notch above everybody else? What are the attitudinal changes that we have to do to undo the pathologies that are there in our generation, in our mothers' generations, and make sure that it doesn't present in the generation just behind us?
You know, at International, this commemoration you were talking about earlier on, the keynote speaker said something that was so important. And she said, every single one of us in South Africa is complicit to the suppression of girl children because it is systemic. It starts in the home, to my earlier example, where the burden of work is put on girl children. It starts in how the boys are treated differently. It starts in you and I being mothers who treat our children differently based on the gender that they are. And ultimately those norms, those dangerous social norms, become the norm, as it were, and hence we fail to make the changes.
And also just in that characterization is that the burden of parenting often falls to women who are then invariably also supporting those homes, and so, you know, there's so many other pressures to making sure that you are hands-on and that you're even beginning to think about how do I raise this child differently to create, you know, a different outcome. I want to quickly come to the issue that you touched on a little bit earlier on, and this is the dangerously and alarmingly high levels of pregnancy across the country's schools, particularly in the 10 to 14 cohort. And beyond the outrage you want the community to express, beyond the hand-wringing and the hair-pulling that we do when we hear these kinds of things, there's a duty of care and a responsibility of action that those who are around those children have to execute, that perhaps they are not and they must.
And that duty of care, you know, it could be one of two ways. So it could be that they honestly don't know that all of us in this community have got a duty to respond to whatever is happening, or there is a fear, like what I was speaking to earlier on, that, well, if I'm, as Linda, go and report on my neighbor, the station commander tells my neighbor Linda is the one that reported. And then it becomes a safety issue for me. So people would rather look at, among a multitude of other things that obviously could affect them, look at what does it mean for me if I'm the one that sticks out to speak out against this kind of behavior. You could also find that everybody is doing it. So what's the big deal? And it fails to be a big deal because everybody is doing it. There's also the issue of the compartmentalizing of who should report what. So earlier on you talked about Department of Health, but the Department of Health comes in right at the end of the whole period because they're only aware that a child is pregnant when the child comes to give birth at the state facility. Prior to the Department of Health knowing, there should be a school. Hence, that's the policy that came into effect earlier this year, that schools should be, you know, part of the reporting value chain. Because the school is the first person to know that there's a learner that hasn't been at school. What's going on? Should we go home and find out? Should we pull in social teams? So all those pieces are actually not working in sync with one another.
And this is the danger. Our society is so perforated, so riven with fissures around dysfunctionality and abdication of duty that time and time again the most vulnerable are failed. You're calling for society to take this seriously. You're not just saying, you know, protest, take to the streets, but we have to hold, as you've just done now, departments accountable for their actions. We have to break the culture of silence and fear. In your advocacy work, what are some of the other opportunity gaps in dealing with the violence or the vulnerability of these two groups of women and girls that we're talking about that we haven't fully exploited?
It's been really ensuring that the children themselves understand what is appropriate and inappropriate behavior towards them. When they don't understand that, it's very easy for them to be manipulated. And one of my biggest disappointments in the last couple of years was when DBE wanted to introduce the understanding of sex education in the classroom so that kids could be aware when they're being abused. And there was an outcry. You know, people were holding banners, teach mathematics, not masturbation, but they'd not even seen the curriculum. And the curriculum was teaching nobody should touch you, and you know, they would draw the body and show the children, don't allow anybody to touch you here. The minute it happens, tell your mom, tell your teacher, tell your grandmother, tell somebody. But we just heard a rumor that it was teaching them about sex and left it at that.
I mean, one of the lamentations of, you know, the social media subculture right now is the outsourcing of opinions and people not pausing enough to be able to do their due diligence in engaging with information before being whipped up into other people's perspectives and that sort of, that culture of groupthink. Linda, thank you for the work that you do. Thank you very much for coming to share some of your thoughts on this important occasion.